Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining in. This lecture series is called the Burkett Miller Distinguished Lecture Series, and it is a forum for scientific inquiry, which brings together internationally recognized scholars, practitioners, and thinkers to the UTC community to speak on topics critical to understanding a market economy. This series is organized by the Probasco Chair, which I now hold as of August of this year. So I'm very thankful to be a member of the UTC community. And the idea behind this is to bring together events to benefit students, faculty, business persons, and the community at large by providing opportunities to critically review controversial ideas. The Probasco Chair Free Enterprise at UTC was established in 1976 by Burkett Miller, a leading Chattanooga attorney and philanthropist. The Probasco Chair is one of the largest endowed chairs of free enterprise in the nation. The mission of the chair is to study the American free enterprise system and the conditions under which it operates most efficiently. As part of that mission, I, as the Probasco Chair, organized the Burkett Miller Distinguished Lecture Series. Past speakers include Nobel laureates such as Vernon Smith, James Buchanan, Robert Lucas. We've also invited and had Steve Forbes, Walter Williams, Art Laffer, and Thomas Sowell. I would also like to mention that the ideas presented by any of our speakers that we ever host at the Probasco Chair on campus are their own ideas and not necessarily representative of the university or the chair holder. But as an educational organization, UTC does not attempt to teach people what to think, but to impart a process of learning how to think for oneself. And now it is my pleasure to introduce someone that I've known for quite some time and I got to study with as a postdoc at NYU, William Easterly. So Easterly is a professor of economics at New York University and co-director of the NYU Development Research Institute. He is the author of 3 books, one of which he's going to be speaking on here in a few minutes, The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor. He also wrote The White Man's Burden and The Elusive Quest for Growth. He's published more than 60 peer-reviewed academic articles. He's written columns and reviews for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times. New York Magazine named him among the top 100 global public intellectuals in 2008 and 2009. He is a highly cited researcher, and Bill also notes that he is the 11th most famous native of Bowling Green, Ohio. I would like to add that even though he says he's from Ohio, he is technically born in West Virginia, so I consider him a fellow Mountaineer. Before we get started and I turn it over to Bill, one thing to mention is that we are going to use the chat for Q&A. So at any time you have a question, feel free to go ahead and put it in the chat. And then after Bill is finished speaking, he is more than happy to answer any of your questions, and I will ask him those questions that you've put in the chat. All right, thank you again for participating. Thank you, Bill, for being willing to join us, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Claudia. It's great to be here with you. I really wish we could all be doing this in person, as I'm sure you guys do too. I'm really so ready to move on from the Zoom COVID world. So I hope there'll be some future occasion in which I get the pleasure of meeting all of you in person. So let's start talking about the tyranny of experts and the forgotten rights of the poor. Let me begin with an example. In 2010, in the district of Mubende, Uganda, the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank, developed a forestry project, which was supposed to increase the productivity of the land compared to what it was then being used for, which was subsistence crops. According to the usual development metrics, this project increased development. It raised Uganda's GDP by taking land and putting it to a more profitable, productive use. But there were some negative consequences. Let me tell you about how the project was implemented. One day, some armed men showed up in Mubende, some armed men to confront the farmers who had been living on the land for several generations. The soldiers burned the farmers' homes and their crops. The soldiers shot their cattle, and the soldiers marched the farmers away at gunpoint from their own lands. So what went wrong here? Sadly, the World Bank experts were telling the peasants of Mubende what they should want, rather than letting them choose what they actually did want. The experts believed the peasants should have wanted forestry, but the peasants actually did want farming. The experts believed the peasants should have wanted to sell their lands, but they actually didn't. So the experts had to use this brutal force to implement a project that nobody wanted, that the experts preferred, but the intended beneficiaries did not prefer. The owners of the land were worse off from a World Bank development project that was supposed to make them better off. Now, this violation of the Mubende farmers' economic, political, and human rights at least got some attention. A British charity called Oxfam publicized this incident, and it actually managed to make it onto the front page of the New York Times in September of 2011. So Laura Fresky and I had this blog called Aid Watch at the time, and we wrote about this on September 22nd, 2011, the day it appeared in the New York Times. And the World Bank was kind of keeping an eye on us on Twitter because we had been somewhat critical of the World Bank occasionally. Don't know why, but sometimes we got carried away with ourselves. The World Bank told us on Twitter that it was, quote, taking the allegation seriously, and said they were, quote, looking into it. Looking, they spelled LKG in Twitter language. So on the Aid Watch, so we're glad to know the World Bank was looking into it, that it was investigating. On the Aid Watch blog, we somewhat mischievously decided to start a clock ticking to mark the time from that moment that the World Bank promised the investigation to when the investigation finally happened. So how long do you think the clock was ticking before the investigation happened? Well, sadly, the clock is still ticking. It's still ticking. Yeah, 248 days is a good guess. I see that on the chat. Thank you for giving me some human contact with the chat, by the way. Yes, the 248 days would have been a good guess. That would have been pretty bad if the World Bank took 248 days. But sadly, nearly 10 years later, the clock has already accumulated 10 years and is still ticking. And at this point, will go on ticking indefinitely. The World Bank never investigated what had happened. It never announced any measures to try to prevent future occurrences like this from happening. And I guess what was discouraging to Laura and I and to other observers at the time was how little the rest of the development community seemed to care about the human rights of poor people, about the political and economic rights of poor people, about the property rights of poor people, about the right to choose their own economic activities of poor people. That caring about the rights of the poor did not happen. And so that's the idea that motivates the idea of the forgotten rights of the poor. The rights of the poor really are forgotten. The peasants of Mubende, Uganda, might have wanted to say to the World Bank, why didn't you just leave us alone? We would have, it would have been better if you had just left us alone. Now, if we translated the phrase left us alone, leave us alone into French, my French is not that great, but the rough translation would be the word laissez-faire. Laissez-faire is an idea that would be an alternative to the tyranny of experts. Leave us alone to make our own choices in a market economy rather than have your experts parachute in and force us to do what we don't want to do. The idea of laissez-faire, of course, goes back to the Enlightenment, to the French economists, and to, most of all, Adam Smith. He has the famous quote that participants in market intend only their own gain, but are led by an invisible hand, the invisible hand of laissez-faire, to promote an end which was not part of their intentions when they participated in market. Individuals that make their own choices in markets on what to supply, they choose voluntarily to supply what has the highest returns to them, which they then find the highest returns for the society as a whole for their investments. So Adam Smith's invisible hand quote was actually that the individual, by directing their own industry in such a manner as that it may be of the greatest value, he intends only his own gain. And he is in this led by the invisible hand to do a social gain that was not part of his intention. So the individuals making their own choices will benefit the rest of us by supplying us with what we're most willing to pay for. Smith's famous butchers, brewers, and bakers supply us with meat, beer, and bread. Smith argued the intentional, unintentional benefits of self-interested butchers and markets were greater than the benefits conveyed by the altruists who are trying to do good. The butcher finds it in their interest to supply the meat that everyone else wants, rather than what some benevolent expert is telling us we should want instead of meat. So Smith said, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. And they were getting a more benevolent outcome than the altruistic experts. Smith actually said those altruists by pursuing, but the butcher by pursuing his own interest frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than he really intends to. He accidentally benefits the society when he thought he was acting in his own self-interest. Whereas the altruistic experts, Smith said, Smith said this, I love this. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. I think of, when reading those words of Smith, I think of lots of development projects that are supposed to be social enterprises, where some brilliant NGO founder or development expert has decided that something like women should be doing handicrafts, which is the idea that every single NGO everywhere has always had about what poor women should be doing. And poor handicrafts that never do make much money except for maybe for the NGO workers to buy, to take home, to decorate their homes with. It turns out that women are actually much better at doing other things than doing the handicrafts that the donors want them to do. So, this is the laissez-faire system, is this alternative to forcing people to do what they do not want to do. In the 20th century, Friedrich Hayek was the economist who offered us the most insight on the unintended but positive consequences of the invisible hand. He has this lovely phrase about competitive markets that I've always loved. He said, "We trust the independent and competitive efforts of many to induce the emergence of what we shall want when we see it." So the beauty of markets is that even if people don't know what they want, even if they couldn't tell themselves what they wanted, they will know it when they see it for themselves, when they're able to choose for themselves. If they don't even know what they want until they see it, how do you expect experts, Hayek said, to give them what they want when experts are doing the planning and deciding what people want for themselves? So Hayek argued, like Smith, that intentional planning by experts actually plays basically little or no role whatsoever in achieving good outcomes in prosperous societies. He had this kind of mournful phrase that I really identify with, which is, the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. I would love that phrase to just be put up in the headquarters of every aid agency and NGO everywhere, to convince the aid experts how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. The key insight of economics is about what you need to actually induce the good unintentional outcomes from the invisible hand. The choice is not between the unintentional and intentional outcomes, because it's impossible for the intentional experts ever to achieve their intentional goals. The choice is really between good unintentional outcomes and bad unintentional outcomes. bad unintentional outcomes like what happened to the poor peasants in Mubende, Uganda. And like in that example, the difference is freedom versus coercion. The key insight of economics is that individual freedom will generally induce good unplanned outcomes, while the use of coercion will generally induce bad unplanned outcomes. In fact, at the time Adam Smith was writing, there were plenty of very bad unplanned outcomes going on. Smith was condemning the coercion of slavery, of conquest, of colonialism. Smith is not very well known for that, but he has some amazingly vivid denunciations of coercion of slavery, conquest, and colonialism and the wealth of nations. Smith said, in effect, just leave them alone. In the 18th century, laissez-faire was emerging as the alternative to slavery and conquest and colonialism. But sadly, in the development tradition, what was being continued was the paternalistic approach of authoritarian governments like colonial governments. All the way up to World War II, colonialism had this paternalistic approach to development, pretty much the same as that of today's development experts. The benevolent colonial official will force colonial subjects to take what they should want rather than letting them choose what they actually do want. After the end of colonialism, the benevolent development experts took over the coercion business from the old benevolent colonial experts. And the issue of freedom versus coercion in economic development, the whole issue that is key to getting good outcomes in unplanned systems of development, the issue of freedom versus coercion was never really addressed, was never really debated. This debate between Hayek's approach to development and the development experts' development sadly never happened. Development experts just showed no interest in freedom whatsoever. And that continues pretty much up until the present day. Development experts today seek to address tragic outcomes with detailed planning to supply the world's poorest people with what they have decided the poorest people need, to send food to the hungry, to replace supposedly inefficient subsistence farms with efficient forestry projects. The development agencies usually mount these incredibly ambitious plans to achieve hundreds of targets at once, such as the Millennium Development Goals effort that was the United Nations was championing from the year 2000 to the year 2015. The United Nations set ambitious plans financed by foreign aid to meet 169 different goals on development well-being by the year 2015. What happened to those targets? Well, not surprisingly, they did not meet most of those goals. They did not make the Millennium Development Goals by the target year of 2015. So having failed to reach those goals by 2015, of course, they invented a new plan called the Sustainable Development Goals that will then be achieved by the year 2030, which is what is now in effect a set of UN agency and aid agency and World Bank and USAID plans to meet the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. But these plans have never had any room for poor people to make their own choices. There seems to be a double standard. With rich people, we're happy to get markets. With the poor people, we give them bureaucrats. Development advocates, they seem to fear that emphasizing ideas like laissez-faire, like unintentional and undesired outcomes, will induce this sort of passivity that they're very afraid of, this sort of hopelessness about development efforts. Of course, it's just the opposite. The laissez-faire economist is very optimistic about the abilities of poor entrepreneurs and individuals to improve their own lives and very pessimistic about the experts. The UN experts are pessimistic about poor people, but very optimistic about themselves. But of course, the laissez-faire economist is not going to make any friends saying that, explaining why things will not work, the UN plans will not work. And Hayek noted again in another phrase that I really identified with by Hayek. Hayek was very aware of how unpopular we laissez-faire economists have always been and will always be. Hayek noted the person who actually does things is always going to be more popular than what he called the economist, the odious individual who explains why the well-meaning efforts of the planners are frustrated. Another angle that reinforces to me the unpopularity of the idea of laissez-faire development is saying, just leave people alone. One big problem with that is it gives us development intellectuals nothing to do. So we might really be afraid of an idea that gives us nothing to do. We might really like an idea that gives us a lot more to do than one that doesn't. And the historian, a great historian who was aware of this problem was the historian of the Russian intelligentsia named Richard Pipes. He noted the similar tendency for Marxist intellectuals to embrace Marxism rather than embrace something like laissez-faire. He noted that the self-interest of the intelligentsia kind of points that way, because the intelligentsia, according to Pipes, they like to see itself, and I'm quoting him, as selflessly dedicated to the public good, but their own interests may well clash with their professed ideals. Their interest to giving themselves some overwhelmingly important role in running the whole society may clash with their ideals of doing good. And Pipes warned all of us, laissez-faire critics, what we faced by criticizing such self-delusions of intellectuals and why this topic has remained off limits for so long. This is a quote from Pipes that I have always loved. Historical experience indicates that any movement that questions the ideology and interests of intellectuals dooms itself to defeat. Yeah, you're right, Mr. Pipes, Professor Pipes, that's really correct. And that any intellectual who challenges his own class condemns himself to obscurity. Right again, Professor Pipes. But despite all these great reasons for the unpopularity of the idea of unintended outcomes cannot simply be wished away. Development planners just don't have enough good incentives and knowledge to reach the intended outcomes. The only choices, again, are good unintended outcomes or bad unintended outcomes. And the economists point the way towards the way to achieve good unintended outcomes is freedom for the individual. Each individual under freedom receives a private return that will align with the social returns to their activities. This alignment of returns only happens under freedom in markets, as Adam Smith explained, at a competitive marketplace with voluntary exchange. In that marketplace, the sales price of a good will be what consumers are willing to pay. So that's the benefit to consumers. And the same price is what the suppliers are willing to accept. So that's the benefit to suppliers. So it aligns benefits to both parties, the suppliers and the consumers. The only system that allows these mutual gains is a competitive market system of voluntary exchanges, of freedom. Coercion destroys the alignment of private and public returns. If the consumer forces the supplier to turn over goods for free at gunpoint, the consumer generates positive private returns for themselves by getting the goods at gunpoint, but rather negative returns for the supplier. The alignment of private and public returns is also vital for political systems, as the fields called public choice have long studied. The government does need, of course, to supply police and courts and other services. Police and courts keep individuals from harming or coercing other individuals or violating the rights of other individuals. The problem, of course, has always been that government officials can also use the police to generate returns for themselves. They can use the police in a corrupt, abusive, or violent way to prey on private individuals and rob them of their own earnings for corrupt political insiders. And so in an authoritarian political system, there's plenty of scope for authoritarian politicians to enrich themselves at the expense of their citizens. But in free political systems, in democracy, liberal democracy with constitutional protections for individuals, public officials who supply honest contract enforcement, protections for property rights, and public goods demanded by the citizens will be rewarded politically by the citizens in a free system. And any public officials that do harm to the citizens will be penalized by the citizens. It doesn't always work out that way. It's not perfect, it's very messy, but in the long run, a free system aligns the incentives of public officials and the interests of the citizens because of the ability in a free system of the citizens to punish the bad officials and reward the good officials. And then, of course, the same economic freedom of choice that leads to good outcomes in Adam Smith's world is also very central to economic development, especially with international trade. Freedom of international trade opens up both the best income opportunities for poor citizens of poor nations, and also offers them the cheapest prices possible for the goods that they want from other suppliers. And this freedom to choose, it often results in very surprising outcomes that may give us a clue to how difficult it would have been to plan any of this and why it really is an unintended outcome of a beneficial, benevolent system. So I have been looking for a long time with some co-authors at the detailed export data on trade by origin country, by destination country, and by really narrow product definitions. And when we do that, we find some kind of surprising combinations that where countries seem to specialize not only by really narrow ranges of products, but also by who they sell those products to. They find a particular customer for a particular product, and then they generate a surprising amount of their own revenue from that specialization, which seems like remarkably chaotic and unplanned, but leads to a lot of development. So we found that Egypt gets a lot of revenue from exporting toilets to Italians. Really, look in the data. A lot of Egypt's revenue comes from exporting toilets to Italians. That's the one that I always found kind of the most surprising. A little less surprising is Kenya is getting a lot of export revenue from sending cut flowers to the Netherlands for those romantic Dutch men to bring home to romantic Dutch women. While Ecuador has got the market on romantic Russian men, Ecuadorians send Russians the flowers that the Kenyans were sending the flowers to the Netherlands. Ugandans, those outside of Mubende who are lucky enough not to be afflicted with World Bank projects, one thing they've really stumbled on is they have somehow captured a significant share of the really high quality coffee market. Something that I noticed because I'm a major coffee fanatic and notice really high quality coffee from Uganda showing up in the world market, not only in the data, but in my old household. It's an extremely high quality coffee that Ugandan peasants, very entrepreneurial, by using real enhanced quality control techniques, were able to achieve just incredibly good coffee that is really competing with the best coffee in the world anywhere. So this is sort of the unplanned, chaotic world of trade that leads to a lot of gains for both the consumers and the suppliers in the international trade market. Global trade is indeed a set of unintended outcomes. It's really hard to imagine some central planner deciding like, Italians, you get your toilets from the Egyptians. Egyptians, you make your money by sending toilets to the Italians. Ecuadorians, you guys take over the flowers for the Russians. Ugandans, you take over the coffee for the New Yorkers. Kenyans, you take over the flowers for the Netherlands, and on and on and on. It's so crazy to think that happening because it doesn't happen. It's all unintentional. It's all the market doing what Hayek said, the emergence of what we shall want when we see it. I wanted Ugandan coffee when I saw it. I didn't know that I wanted it before then. But in aid and development, sadly, there often is not a market economy, but there is an economy that is based on planning, which if it goes into an unfree system can actually do harm rather than good. One example that has been pointed out by some academic researchers is that food aid sent by USAID and other aid donors can actually increase violence when it is sent into poor countries. The argument is that food aid, especially if it goes into a country where there's already conflict going on, that food aid is very often captured by the warlords or the insurgents And they used the food aid to pay their own soldiers to buy weapons. And the violence these researchers found, and it was confirmed by other researchers since then, actually increases in a way that they argue was caused by food aid. They argue statistically that this was all caused by food aid. So examples are like Somali warlords and the Taliban in Afghanistan have managed to capture food aid, and then that has fueled the violence in Somalia and Afghanistan. And then, of course, economic policies that are based on a high degree of coercion also have pretty disastrous effects, cause a big divergence between private and social returns. A common example in many poor countries for a long time was the government would, any sort of major cash crop producers would be forced by the government to turn over their cash crops to something like a government marketing board at a highly controlled price. And then the government would resell the cash crop on the world market and generate huge revenues, which usually accrued to corrupt insiders within the government, and then killed off the cash crop. So a great example of this is cocoa producers in Ghana, which by their own entrepreneurial efforts had captured a lot of the world's cocoa market. A lot of your chocolate was being supplied by Ghanaian cocoa exporters. But then with the advice of some development experts, the Ghanaian government set up this cocoa marketing board. It actually started in colonial times and was continued by the authoritarian regime after the authoritarian colonial regime, after the authoritarian regime in Ghana, after the independence of Ghana. So the cocoa marketing board forced the Ghanaian cocoa producers in the Ashanti region of Ghana to sell to them at this really severely controlled price that was pathetically unrelated to the world price. So by 1983, when this system had been going on a long time, the cocoa producers were only getting 6% of the world price, and the government was capturing together 94%. Now, you might think, as I did, that probably the cocoa producers, they also would have a big incentive to smuggle the cocoa onto the black market and try to sell the cocoa on the black market to get a decent price. But the Ghanaian government responded to that also with announcing a death penalty for smugglers. So there's an extreme amount of coercion going on. And the result was you were just killing off the cocoa sector of Ghana. Ghana was no longer the world's cocoa producer. And so again, there's the idea of, oh, it would have been so much better if you had just left them alone, laissez-faire, leave them alone, leave us alone. So now I have been saying the idea of a beneficial laissez-faire under individual liberty, it does seem to leave, and this bothers me too, it leaves us in the development intelligentsia with nothing to do. Even a laissez-faire advocate would like something to do. Well, the examples given here suggest ways that development experts as advocates and educators, we can suggest at least the principles that will improve outcomes in a way that are probably already understood without us offering those brilliant insights. So the case of food aid and violence is pretty suggestive that you really don't want to inject aid into a system based on violence in the middle of a conflict. And understanding this would have prevented some of the gigantic aid debacles that happened in Somalia and Afghanistan. After years of aid and years of war in Afghanistan, has neither developed nor has the Taliban been defeated or has the violence ended. So, development was a disaster all the way around because it was just going into a violent system. And it follows also that aid going into society where the government is violating economic and political rights is not going to lead to good outcomes. The Mubende example in Uganda happened because the Ugandan government was authoritarian and oppressive and corrupt. And the US aid donors and World Bank and British aid donors decided this was really okay and the Ugandan government should get aid anyway. And so we had the tragedy of Mubende farmers losing their lands at gunpoint. So, the best way to make aid have some chance of working is for aid to be sent to free societies, to be able to, in a free society, at least there's hope that without so much violence and coercion, that aid at least might go into the pockets of poor people, enabling them to buy some necessary goods they need for themselves on the market. That would be great. So are the aid donors aware of this need to direct aid into free societies? Well, let me give you some statistics on that. Suppose we rank all the aid recipients from the best freedom to the worst freedom in the world. We're going to use an index that the World Bank itself created on political and economic rights of people in many societies many countries around the world. So let's rank all the countries of the world. There are 120 aid recipients in the data. We're going to rank them again from the worst oppressors to the best freedoms. So the worst 30 countries, which is the 1/4 of the sample of aid recipients that is made up of the 30 worst countries. Let's compare what happens with aid to them with aid to everyone else. So let's just see if aid is at least successful in shunning the worst countries, which they really should be shunning if they don't want to have aid go into a violent, coercive environment where it might be doing a lot more harm than good. Are they shunning the 30 worst countries? So let me give you the statistics. Since 2001, aid to the 30 least free, worst country recipients, aid to those 30 least free, worst countries has increased 300% since 2001. Aid to everyone else, the other 3/4 that are not as corrupt and oppressive as the worst, aid to everyone else increased 35%. Aid to the worst increased 300%. Now, if you want, during the Q&A, we can talk a little bit about why that happened. It probably happened partly because the US and the British were very eager that aid go to their allies in international conflicts like the War on Terror. And it turns out that really corrupt, autocratic, oppressive rulers make very good allies in the War on Terror. So the aid agencies were pushed, perhaps by political motivations, to direct their aid overwhelmingly to the most brutally corrupt and oppressive autocrats in the world, where it is least likely that aid will do any good, and most likely that aid will actually do harm. So aid is, at this point, actually has been going in the wrong direction. So now at least that gives us something to do as development advocates. We can advocate as development advocates that let's reverse this. This is crazy. Let's reverse this. Let's actually shun the worst oppressors as aid recipients, and let's direct much more aid to free societies. So let me give you a little bit more, some more news that is a little bit more happy and optimistic, which is that that example that I gave you of coercive policies that killed off cocoa in Ghana, that one actually has been corrected. That's really good news. Maybe partly by the efforts of development experts arguing that that was a destructive policy, probably mostly by Ghanaians themselves who knew that it was a destructive policy. And so this kind of advocacy of doing away with extremely coercive, destructive economic policies has actually made considerable progress around the world. By and large, the most extreme taxation of market transactions, most extreme taxation of exports, most extreme government economic controls of price controls, things like very high inflation, things like interest rate controls that give savers a punitive negative real interest rate on their savings, extreme policies that destroy trade by having extreme quotas and tariffs on trade. Most of those extremes have actually faded into history. Something has happened that we've been successful somewhere in making it happen, that there have been economic reforms that have done away with the most extreme state controls, most extreme state coercion, and GDP growth has responded. The countries that liberalized the most, especially in Africa and Latin America, were precisely the ones that had the most growth recoveries after the stagnation that was happening while the controls were in place. So I wanted to make sure that before I end my talk today, I did offer you some good news. That's really good news. How is this progress that is happening on market reforms even possible, despite the great intellectual backlash that is happening against globalization, against free trade, against free markets? Well, it turns out that economists arguing for freedom have a powerful ally. We have really a powerful ally when we are campaigning for the rights of poor people, for the political and economic rights of poor people. There is one group that is really effective at campaigning for the rights of poor people. And that group is made up of the poor people themselves. People themselves have been campaigning for their own political economic rights. And that has fueled some of the successes that we have seen for greater political and economic freedom. For example, in Africa, one recent book documented that there were over 90 popular protests in 40 countries in Africa during the 2005-2014 period over which this book was collecting data. Poor people are really not happy when their rights are forgotten. They really find a way to protest and campaign for their own rights. With more recent data worldwide, there is a great report issued recently that compiles the data up to 2019 and finds that in 2019, 42% of the world's countries had popular protests going on for greater political rights, against corruption, against autocracy, against oppression. 42% of the world's countries had protests of that kind. And this report that I read actually had managed to somehow compile these kind of reports all the way back to when some of these countries were colonial territories back to 1900. And this index of 42% of the world's countries having protests was the highest, countries and territories in the world having protests. That was the highest it had ever been since 1900. So today, protest is the highest it has ever been. And a lot of that protest is in fact indeed for greater political and economic freedom for poor people, by poor people. So the least we development economists can do at this point is to support poor people campaigning for their own rights. So I really think there is plenty of room for hope for the advocates of freedom for the world's poor. Really, it's time that all of us advocates in rich countries and poor countries increased even more those efforts to campaign for freedom, so that development of the people, by the people, and for the people does not perish from the earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. That was fantastic. I am going to turn over to the Q&A through the chat. And so we already have a few questions that have popped up. Hamet, one of our professors in the business school, asked, are there not examples of successful projects which are well conceived and executed? Should there be efforts to prevent badly conceived projects by involving affected people to participate in defining those projects?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So, the typical pattern that I have always found with talks and with Q&A is that you make some strong statements in the talk, and then you start to offer the qualifications during the Q&A. So, we need the strong statements to start the debate, and then we need the qualifications to keep things honest. So yes, there are good aid projects. Some of the best aid projects happen in areas where maybe you don't quite need as much feedback from citizens to prevent doing harm. So a lot of successes happen in the health area, where things like vaccination programs and making antibiotics available, or in Africa making HIV/AIDS drugs available to treat HIV. Those have been quite successful. And so there are successful aid projects, partly because there are areas where experts are not quite as incompetent as others. Health, I think, is one of those areas. And you're right, there are also efforts by aid agencies are somewhat aware that maybe we should be asking the aid recipients whether they want what we're giving them. They're nowhere near as aware of that as I would have liked, but at least they tried to put out some rhetoric about that. So one of their favorite terms is that we are consulting civil society. It's consulting civil society. I love that. It's not quite the same as recognizing the political and economic rights of poor people, but it's at least a claim that we're consulting someone, and they call it civil society. I remember my daughter when she was an undergraduate, and my oldest daughter when she was an undergraduate in college asked me, like, I have this term coming up in my economics class called civil society. What is that? I said, actually, I've been hearing that word for 20 years and I still don't know what it means. So what it seems to mean is that the World Bank, when it goes into a country, finds someone to appoint some locally cooperative officials or NGO that they can appoint that will give them some favorable reactions on what they're doing. Excuse me. And they call that consulting civil society. Maybe I'm being a little unfair to them. They are sincere. They are trying. It's really hard in the aid world which is based on plans and giving away things that people have not asked for, to make it really possible to consult the intended beneficiaries as to what they want. It's not. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not even sure that it's completely possible in the aid world, but we do have an alternative, which is at least leave people alone. Don't violate their own rights, and let them have access to the market system to meet their needs.
Okay. Gabriel Jones posted a comment that I would say that among the roots of the market economy are implied cultural axioms. One such axiom would be the golden rule: treat others how you would like to be treated. By recognizing and acting out the implicit divinity of the individual, the invisible hand activity flourishes throughout the community culture. So that dates back to the Enlightenment. And so I think that brings up something that you and I have talked about, and a lot of my research is focused on lately, is the role of culture and cultural norms. And how that kind of can play out in transitioning to more of a rights-based system.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. Gabriel, I love your reference to the golden rule, because that's something that I have noticed that Adam Smith was actually very aware of when he was writing about the invisible hand. So, the invisible hand is very often criticized as, like, how can it possibly be true that someone acting selfishly could be doing good for other people? Surely someone acting selfishly would actually be doing something harmful to other people. And Adam Smith would have understood that criticism, and he would have said, yeah, you're right. You need some constraint on self-interest to prevent doing harm to other people. And that constraint is the idea of what you're calling the golden rule, that you have to be willing to recognize the other party's right to consent to a transaction in the same way in the golden rule that you would like them to recognize your right to consent. And only the mutual recognition of these rights to consent only that will make possible beneficial market exchanges. If cultural norms or laws or whatever kind of permit harmful action, if it permits individuals cheating and stealing from other individuals, then no market transactions are possible. None are going to happen. The market is not even possible in that environment. It's all just going to be looting and war and conflict and Hobbesian war of all against all. And so, yes, you do need, Adam Smith was very emphatic about, yes, you do need rules of the game, some idea of justice, some idea of recognizing everyone's right to consent and participating in the market. And, the other thing that, as I mentioned, Adam Smith was very critical of conquest and slavery. And that was exactly where that came from. Adam Smith was like, you could have just traded with the people you were conquering. You could have just had a free labor market instead of enslaving people. And if you had freedom of all parties to consent to transactions, you would have avoided this horrible damage that you were doing through conquest and slavery. So, Adam Smith was very clear about that. And I think it's very important that we all remember that as well, that it really is, the invisible hand really does require respecting everyone's right to consent.
Okay, so another question from Hemant is that why not use aid to push dictators to provide freedom?
That's a good idea. It hasn't been tried that often because, the aid donors have always had a reason to want to reward dictators to be on their side. As during the Cold War, they wanted allies. During the War on Terror, they've wanted allies. So unfortunately, the aid donors have never been that interested in punishing dictators to push them to have freedoms. Occasionally, they have had attacks of conscience, or there was a brief period between the Cold War and the War on Terror when there was some talk about promoting freedom and so on. And, you know, when it's been tried, frankly, it doesn't, I'm not saying it's going to be that easy or that it would work that well to use aid to do that. What I was trying to say is at least don't give aid into coercive, destructive, violent places where it's going to do harm. And if aid going in societies that are already free is more likely to do good. But I'm really not sure if aid could be used to push for more freedom. Partly because, you know, homegrown activists often do not really want foreigners to meddle in their politics, and the dictators can often get more support by claiming that they're being persecuted by, you know, pushy foreigners who are trying to invade or coerce them from the outside in some kind of neo-colonial way to do something they don't want to do. And so it doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily going to work that well. What I think works better is just unconditional advocacy of freedom everywhere. That where freedom is being fought for by homegrown activists, that we're on their side, we support them. We have kind of an international alliance of all of us homegrown activists in every society supporting each other around the world in our fight for freedom. Of course, you know, we very much need to fight for freedom in my own country, the US also, and in some of your own countries.
Okay, our next question was posted in the Q&A, and it reads, how do the risk of climate change affect your perspective on international development needs and opportunities?
Yeah, so one thing you should watch out for is experts giving confident answers in areas that are not their specialty. So climate change is not my specialty. I know very little about it. You know, I have vaguely heard of something called a carbon tax, which sounds like a really good idea to address climate change and using an economist mechanism of incentives to reduce carbon emissions. It does seem to be, it is one of many possible examples where there are externalities, where there's, you know, the actions of one agent accidentally have negative consequences for another agent. And, you know, the usual economist answer to that is something like the carbon tax, that you try to get the agent that is causing harm to other people to pay for the harms they're causing, or to discourage them from those harms by putting a tax on those harmful activities, or putting a prohibitive price on harmful activities, and use the market to correct those negative effects that they're having.
Okay, the next question. Are cooperative business models like Mondragon in Spain a scalable solution to equitable international development?
Sorry, I don't actually know that much about Mondragon in Spain. You want to say more about what it's doing? Again, always trust the person who admits they don't know the answer.
I'm not sure if we've got.
Okay, let's give them more time to reply.
Well, we can circle back, yes. So we can go to the next one.
Yep.
So the next question asks, are non-international NGOs, regional or in the country, any better than large organizations such as the World Bank or UN where these projects are concerned?
I always think that local people are more likely to know about solutions to local problems than arrogant outsiders like me parachuting in from outside, arriving on first-class travel and staying in the luxury airport and talking only to the taxi drivers. You know, it's very likely that local NGOs and homegrown organizations and academics and advocates and community workers are going to know a lot more than the outside experts do. It's obviously not a foolproof system, because the whole problem with the philanthropy system is it's really, really hard to come up with the right incentives to reward the philanthropists for being really careful to do good things. And that's true of both local and foreign philanthropy, that you somehow have to hold the philanthropists accountable, that they're somehow would be penalized if they do something bad, and they will be rewarded if they do something good. And so far, we haven't found a a good way to make that happen in any philanthropic system, which is why I'm more enthusiastic about, markets and democracy than I am about philanthropy, frankly. But of course, we are all going to keep trying with the philanthropy. It's just not that easy to make it work.
Right. So the next question is from Professor Sheena Murray. She's an econ professor here, and she asked, so much of this is focused on aid programs. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the success of the Asian tigers, who grew through aggressive government intervention and industrial planning. Is the aid issue about outsiders doing the planning, or is the issue with planning itself?
So I think the issue is both with the outsiders and with the planning itself. So the outsiders are likely to do the worst plans that are completely clueless about what people want or need. The insiders are a little more likely to be in touch with what people want or need, but there's still the defect of planning that you're trying to dictate answers that are not really under your control, because they're, in a free for all of politics and markets. You're trying to dictate the answers. You're not going to get the outcome that you want. You're going to get something like the Mubende example or the food aid example that's going to turn out to be the opposite of what you wanted. So what I think happened with the Asian tigers is actually most of their growth is mostly associated with opening up markets. And they did make a lot of noise about planning and about priorities for certain sectors. And there was some government intervention and rewarding certain sectors that did well at exporting. So it's never a clean world where we get pristine answers and obvious good and bad guys. But I think it's still, the big picture is still that the Asian tigers became the Asian tigers by just taking massive advantage of world international trade, taking massive advantage of globalization and being able to succeed through participating in international trade and becoming rich by, South Korea went in one generation from, providing almost nothing to markets to providing, a lot of the American car market, to sending amazing amount of cars into the American market and just putting out of business American car companies. And I think a lot of that happened because, you had dynamic entrepreneurs like the founder of Hyundai, who kind of started as an auto mechanic during World War II and built up Hyundai to take over the US market. I think too much credit is given to authoritarian rulers who just happen to be on the scene when some dynamic market process is going on. I think when you see a big export success, it's because someone just was able to take advantage of market incentives to succeed in the global market.
Okay. Next question was posted in our Q&A from RBG. That's all the information I have. But the question or the statement says, I want to thank Professor Easterly for his work. I read one of his books over a decade ago and made me fall in love with the development literature. His work, along with other development scholars, are the reason I became an academic. Thank you for your work. It is an inspiration that we one day may have a better world. Independent of that comment,
thank you.
I have a question. I know.
Can you just stop there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can end it now. So end on top. So her question is, I do have a question. Is it fair to say that development can be a positive sum game where everyone wins? And when we violate the basic tenets of liberal economics, laissez-faire economics, that we unnaturally create a negative sum game, the coercion?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone does win under, when there is liberty for everyone to choose for themselves and to consent to their own transactions. It does make possible the mutual gains from exchange, which are the whole basis of all of us becoming better off. And that when there's coercion involved, then you are automatically creating a negative sum game. Now I admit that's a very simple view of the world, and sometimes simple views are very useful to kind of really give us clarity about the big issues. The world is a more complicated place than that, so there are lots of details that we need to make all those happy things happen. And we're not talking about utopias, we're talking about very messy human beings where we all make many, many stupid mistakes, both in markets and in democracy. So we're not talking about, there are no utopian alternatives on the table. We're talking about making the best of a messy world.
Okay, so from that, Pete Calcagno, who's at College of Charleston, he's an econ professor. He asks, he says, the bigger issue is to let these individuals grow through their own entrepreneurship. How do we encourage the institutions to promote this type of free enterprise? Is education our best tool?
Yeah, I think education is a great tool. I mean, I think one thing that aid donors could have done a lot more, and they haven't really done, is just give lots of money for scholarships from poor countries. Scholarships for engineers, for MBAs, for PhD economists, for anything. I think that would create a lot of homegrown talent that will then become even more able. They're already very able, but are even more able to take advantage of the opportunities in markets for better outcomes. Probably the donors haven't wanted to do that because probably one of the big reasons is they're really afraid of brain drain, that they'll pay for the education of someone from a poor country, and then that person will wind up working in the United States, earning a fat salary, and they don't like that outcome. I actually think that is still not a bad outcome, because those individuals, like if you've paid for the PhD in economics of a Ghanaian, like my wonderful colleague Yao and Yarko at NYU, Yao, to take a classic brain drain example, spends, as a professor full-time at NYU. But he's a wonderful inspiration to me, the way he has done so much for his home country of Ghana, in both connecting Ghanaian entrepreneurs with business opportunities, connecting Ghanaian academics with the rest of the academic world, connecting government officials with policy advice from him and others. I think educating poor people from poor societies is good no matter where they wind up.
Okay, so Blake Guerin in the Q&A, he asked, he said, I've seen a lot of press on the rise of donut sustainable development models being implemented in cities like Brussels and Amsterdam. They offer a balance between social dignity safety nets, as well as environmental considerations too, and in theory drive all sections of society towards some defined level of prosperity. Are those safety nets and environmental restraints violating laissez-faire principles? Or can there be a level of social safety regulation that exists in a laissez-faire model?
Yeah, I mean, of course, one of the things that people are worried about with markets is that markets can be very volatile and can suddenly cause people to suddenly drop out of when something they were doing that used to be profitable suddenly becomes unprofitable because of some market shift. They can sort of fall into poverty and suffer a lot. And so some kind of social safety net is certainly an idea worth discussing, to kind of offer some kind of insurance against really bad outcomes. It's not very well known, but Hayek himself was a big fan of some kind of a safety net. He thought that was actually a good idea, and it would actually increase the support for the benefits of markets if you design some well thought out safety net. So I don't think that's contradictory to laissez-faire. I think it's a way to make laissez-faire more likely to be accepted by a wider range of people, and thus get the benefits of laissez-faire.
So we got a description on the company in Spain. He says it's a large conglomerate owned by its employees. So it's free market, but does not consolidate wealth. As compared to socialist countries with command and control economies and capitalist economies whose multinational corporations have driven great wealth disparities and wealth extraction. So I guess, what are your thoughts on some sort of more employee-owned companies in the development process?
Yeah, again, I think you know a lot more about it than I do. So I would rather hear what you have to say rather than what I have to say. But your concern about wealth disparities and inequality, I think that's another big concern that all of us have about a laissez-faire market system. It's certainly a fair concern. There's this concern that some people will get very, very rich and others will get very poor in a market system, and that certainly happens. But I think the consent versus coercion debate is actually a good way to think about that kind of inequality. The worst kind of inequality would be if someone was getting rich by coercing or oppressing other people. That would be the worst kind of inequality, such as was happening with slave owners under slavery, or authoritarian governments giving special privileges to monopolies in their own countries who then become rich by just forcing their products on poor quality products on the whole population and forcing them to buy them. So I think consent and coercion is a way to kind of discriminate across different kinds of inequality, and to kind of prioritize that the worst kind of inequality would be, something based on coercion. Whereas if there is consent, at the very least, when Steve Jobs got rich, it was really because the rest of us really wanted Apple products. At least we're getting something that we really want in return for making him rich. So that consensual exchange may have made him extremely obscenely rich, but at least we are getting something out of it. So that's the benefits of a consensual exchange in a laissez-faire economy.
Okay, another question from finance professor Bento. He asked, are pandemic-induced lockdowns a violation of human rights? When is it appropriate to place restrictions on private behavior?
Oh, okay. Again, you're taking me into something where I just should really say, I don't know. I don't know that area. Why don't you ask someone who knows a lot more than I do? That'd be much more beneficial to you. No, I won't talk about that area specifically. Certainly in principle, again, we're talking about the issue of, if there's something the individual is doing that's harming somebody else, then we need some way of thinking about that. So, and that's, it's particularly tricky with contagious diseases, because of course, if I'm engaged in some kind of risky behavior that makes me more likely to get sick or to spread sickness to somebody else, and that again is like a negative externality. It's a negative consequence that I'm creating for somebody else who hasn't consented to it. By my behavior, I'm creating something bad for them. So we need some way of dealing with that. And frankly, I don't know enough about the health area to offer you any good advice on that. It's certainly it's always true that economists say we need to find some way of getting the individual, giving an incentive to the individual to not do harm to others. So giving some incentive during the pandemic to convince individuals to be very careful to not spread the virus to somebody else. That's where the answer is going to lie. What exactly that answer looks like, I don't know enough about that area to give you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Who's from Nick Reinhardt, who's a grad student in economics at MTSU. He says, how can we promote the idea of free markets and economic freedom in developing nations within the context of local cultures? Is this too monumental of a task at the moment?
Well, frankly, I think a lot of the local cultures of countries that I know in Africa or Latin America is often more friendly to free markets than the US culture is at the moment. There's so much hostility towards free markets in the US at the moment. I think it would be kind of arrogant of us to say that, the problem is with somebody else that they don't like. They don't appreciate the possible gains, mutual gains from trade and markets, when it's really, these days, it seems to be Americans above all who seem to really have trouble understanding culturally what that argument means, and seem to be willing to, use severe controls to control those markets and not achieve the benefits from mutual gains from exchange.
Okay, well, thank you so much for taking your time to talk with us. Highly enjoyed it. I have copies of Easterly's book, Tyranny of Experts. So if any of you would like one, I have them available for you, and we can figure out a way to make that exchange. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me, or I'm sure Dr. Easterly would be more than happy to continue these conversations, and hopefully we will have you on campus soon.
I would love that.
Okay, take care. Thanks again,
Great
everyone.
to talk with all of you. Thank you, all of you.
All right, bye-bye.